Hi, this is Robert Shear with another edition of Sheer Intelligence, which sounds pretentious as all get out, but the intelligence comes from my guests. It was to me by the NPR station in Santa Monica. They thought that was cute. Thanks to the attacks on NPR, I'm no longer with that station, but I'm available on the Sheer Post, which I happen to be the publisher of, so I don't think I'll be fired anytime soon. I want to say something about my guest who has just had a remarkable career. And let me just give the Charles Derber, and most remarkable to me, because I think I'm a pretty hot shot kind of writer. I've written, I think, 12 books, or sometimes I say 13, sometimes 11. But this guy's written 29 books, and they're really important. I mean, they're rise to the level of a C. Wright Mills and sociology and come to grips with what is power in the society, how does it work, how is it sustained, and so forth. So, not to take anything away from the others, but as opposed to Seymour Martin Lipset or some that I recall one, it's much more cutting edge, it's much more provocative. And right now, and what also the current book, Bonfire, Americans Sociocide, which we'll discuss, and the Quest for Democracy, is a wonderful book in many respects, but most important for someone like myself who's done about 500 of these shows. It's mercifully small and short, and but powerful. I mean, it really is clear, and the argument that it makes is incredibly disquieting, but thoughtfully presented, and with a great deal of authoritative argument. That we're at the end, if I want to use the religious one, well, end of times. Only the Messiah is not going to come. It's probably just the cockroaches are going to take over with some kind of nuclear war. And yet, it's fun to read. It's exciting. It's good prose. So I'm not trying to turn anybody off. I hardly recommend it, but I wanted to challenge the thesis. And I was just told by your wonderful agent, uh, Lorna, that this is part of a trilogy. But having read your book and finishing it only last night, I started reading months ago when you were going to come on, and then I screwed up or I got sick or something. But a trilogy, I thought, if after reading your book, I don't know if we're going to be around next week. And I'm being serious. I mean, and I want to talk about our age. You're kind of a youngster compared to me. We're separated by, I guess, about almost 2 decades. I was born in the middle of the Depression, and I went through the war, and I grew up not relatively, very poor in the Bronx. And the war was scary, the Depression was scary. So I actually was amazed in the post war prosperity. I didn't think it would last, and I spent a lot of my career finding cracks in the system and predicting disaster of one kind or another. That was kind of my mindset and looking for things going south, including I remember Eric Fromm, people like that, and writing well, actually Orwell, in 1984, and others writing about could it happen here? Could
Yes.
fascism come here? And it's interesting. We always attribute these terrible totalitarian regimes to other people who have the wrong religion or the wrong color or skin color or the wrong whatever. But actually, the irony in World War II is the people that were the most dangerous of all modern history in every respect actually were represented as the biggest minority in the country, German Americans. And so we were fighting against people that were difficult to racially profile as the enemy. We did it easily with the Japanese, but not with the Germans. So the question I do remember as a young person, can it happen here, was the title of more than one book. And now, after reading Bonfire, for the first time, I am truly depressed. And I don't mean the book is depressed, but you make a cogent argument that it may be game over. So let me take that thought and ask you, how could you then be planning to do a trilogy? Who's going to read it? Who's going to be alive?
Well, I'm sure thank you for that introduction, Robert. I really appreciate it. It's very kind. Um, and, one of the contradictions I think you and I share is the idea that contradiction itself drives history. So the idea that we're in a very grim, potentially end moment, we've been in that period actually for some time. It's taken a new form now, but it's not incompatible with the idea that new forms of resistance and struggle are going to bring about new times that are much more hopeful. And so this book is, I mean, the way I think about it, I've been talking about it to podcasters and media. And, it is this contradiction of a really grim diagnosis, because the idea of sociocide, which a lot of people haven't heard, but when you hear the word sociocide, most people think of suicide. And that's not what I'm talking about, because I'm not talking about individual suicide, although it's a kind of outcome of sociocide in part. But by sociocide, I mean a process by which society destroys itself, pulls itself apart. And so this book is arguing that, even long before Trump, we were on a trajectory of sociocide. I had written a book, I don't know if you saw it, Robert, called Sociopathic Society about 10 years ago. And that argued that you could have a sociopathic society was one in which the society breeds antisocial dominant values and institutions. And the idea of a sociocidal society is one in which the sociopathy of society has become so radical and extreme that society itself, the survival of the society itself, is at stake. It's sort of in a way, for those who know a little sociology, Emil Durkheim, who wrote, in the late 19th century, was writing about the rise of, a kind of breakdown of the forms of solidarity and social cohesion that in modernity, that might, he think, led to both individual suicide. He wrote a book called Suicide, but he saw correctly as a sort of social thinker, that individual suicide arose under periods in which people were being disconnected from other people. When you talked about the subtitle of my book, you missed two words, which are broken relations. So the book is called Bonfire: American Sociocide, Broken Relations, and the Quest for Democracy.
Let me
And
let me be a little defensive here. I read it on Kindle. Maybe that's treachery, but
no, no, not at all.
was that in the title on
It's in the
Kindle?
subtitle. Yeah, it's
Oh,
called.
okay. Then my error. I'm sorry. I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
no problem. But
Uh,
it's just to say, to sort of continue the thread, when society, America has always been an individualistic society, sort of that kind of value system that says focus on me, 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 and get ahead. That's the way American way. That's the American capitalist way. It's the capitalist way generally. So I kind of bring together kind of Marx and Durkheim in thinking about American society as one in which the level of focus on individual survival, individual self-interest has become so acute that it's really pulling the society apart. I don't know if you've ever seen it, Robert, but there's a book that was written by a famous anthropologist called The Mountain People. It was about the IK. It was a tribal group that was displaced in Uganda into a very remote area where there was no food. And what the anthropologist found was that there was no, he called it the loveless society. There was no empathy. There was no care for other people at all. Because if you and I were there, Robert, and you were part of my family, if I went out to try to scavenge food for yourself, I would die that day, because there was so little food that people who didn't devote all their energy into finding food for themselves would die, literally. And so people were selling out their family. There was only the me. There was no we. There was no sense of collectivity. And I make the argument in this book that long before Trump, these sociopathic, social, and now sociocidal forces are pulling America apart. I've just had a talk in my first day of class with my students this semester about social media and how they viewed it. And they said they spent 4 hours a day on the screen. I do have stuff in social on Silicon Valley in the book, and they said they spend 3 or 4 hours a day, but they feel disconnected to almost everybody they talk to online. And that's one of the things I look at in this book, how, big, the most powerful corporations, the most wealthy people in society who are surrounding Trump and are part of his oligarchy, are part of this new ecosystem of communication. I call it a logarithmic wiring of power, which basically is a way of connecting people in disconnected forms of relationship controlled by corporate elites who have very strong interest in the kind of information people have about each other and how they relate to each other. Solidarity is very dangerous to elites. So we're building through the online world a form of communication and connection, which my students validate is incredibly disconnecting and alienating. They don't trust other people. They feel they don't know who the influencers are on their media feed and so forth. And so we have a generation growing up that is feeling increasingly isolated, at war with, a competition for jobs. People are buying guns at levels never seen before because they feel so distrustful and scared of other people. The biggest buyer of guns, by the way, is women who they're not buying it to hunt or sport. They're buying it for protection. They're buying guns for their kids. There's a lot of money to be made in selling guns right now. Um, and so a lot of this book is about these longer term forces that have given rise to Trump. Because in the end, you probably know, Robert, that Hannah Arendt, who knew something about Nazi Germany, wrote in one of her famous phrases that loneliness was at the heart of fascism. And what she was saying by that was that there was something about when people are feeling isolated, competitive, distrustful, and scared, that they are easily mobilized by right wing kind of authoritarian forces. And a strong man or a fascist leader who says, I alone can protect you. You're scared. I understand why you're scared. There are, aliens among us who are out to destroy you, and I am going to protect you. So after analyzing this breakdown of relationships, again, just to make one slightly more academic reference, we talk about capital, but how often do Americans, there's a famous person I know you know, Robert, named Bourdieu, Pierre Bourdieu, a French theorist who wrote about what he called social capital. By what he meant is social capital, like financial capital, is a critical resource for survival. And what he meant by social capital was the kinds of capacities and relationships that enabled a person to flourish. It involved a kind of network of safety and social community that was in the workplace and in the society that allows people to survive and function without a dictatorial regime that's basically going to keep people feeling safe through what we're seeing unravel in the United States today. So I think there's a crisis of both economic and social capital in America today, meaning the ordinary person. It's interesting. I don't know if you know this, Robert, but there's been some recent surveys of the Trump base and what kind of social relationships they have with each other. And it turns out, actually, the American Enterprise Institute and some others did some conservative surveys, did some survey work on this. And the people living in the biggest civic deserts of America, places which don't have public gardens or public spaces that are safe or don't have pub cafes, are areas where the lower income and working class people live. And these polls show over and over again that the people who experience the most social isolation and fear and sense of distrust of people are working people, lower income people, non-college educated people in the Trump base. Meanwhile, the Surgeon General of the United States just last year published a thing you might have seen. It's called The Epidemic of Loneliness in America, where he just finds things like the number of Americans who eat all their meals alone is rapidly rising. I've seen figures up to 68%. The number of people who say their friendship, number of friends that they have is declining rapidly. Something like 20 or 30% say they have no friends, nobody they feel they can talk to. This is sort of ick-like, going back to the Ugandan thing. And
Okay.
what we're seeing is
And
that, yeah, I just want to say, so this social unraveling is a big part, along with the breakdown of unions and the breakdown of labor solidarity, which is being engineered by our new robber barons in Silicon Valley and then the old robber barons who are aligned with them. is creating a crisis of social and economic capital, which is leading, in my view, to the rise of the kind of authoritarian American fascism that we're seeing. Although that has a long history, and as you know, Robert, I've been writing a series of books about the history of American authoritarianism, which long precedes Trump.
Okay, so let me take issue with a certain aspect of what you
Sure,
just said. Okay,
please.
first of all, let me play director here. I need you to step back a little bit or sit back a little
Okay.
further from the camera, even more so, just because you seem to be just in the lower right corner
Oh,
here.
okay. Yeah.
Okay. And but I don't want to make you uncomfortable or anything.
No,
Yeah,
no, that's fine.
if you could yeah, raise yourself. The other, but I want to take issue with this thesis, not with your fears of what's happening, but why it's happening. And it seems to me a bit. I know that's not your intention. It blames the mass, or at least the blames the mass for its response to the alienation, to the advertising, to social networking, to there's that lures them in, but they and so uh, and so Trump is just is a reflection of that. But I see this. There's another possible explanation, because
I just want to interrupt you 1 second. The book is very heavily, if you took a look at it, Robert, it's about the role of elites, very
I
powerful
understand.
people for example, this breakdown of relationships is heavily focused on the workplace. There's an effort to
I got
deconstitutionalize
that.
unions.
I read the book.
Okay.
Okay,
So
I'm
you
not.
know that I'm not blaming the individuals. I'm saying that we've got a system at work which is further, it's always been the case of capitalism that it tries to erode worker solidarity and to break down relations. I just think it's taking a somewhat more acute and worrisome phase now.
Okay, so but let me offer somewhat not a criticism, but just a
Mm.
way of beginning a conversation.
Sure.
Okay, it seems to me, where my only criticism really is that you make it sound like an ever evolving but gradually evolving process, and now Trump is there. But I think something has happened in the last 20 years, or actually since Bill Clinton. I'm not the only person. I've written about it a little bit myself. I wrote about the financial collapse, and it's not an accident that the unions disappeared; they were crushed. It's not an accident that there are three human beings who have the same wealth as the lower 50% of the population.
Right.
But
Which I
that's
write a lot in the book. Yes.
I know, but I'm trying to get to the central argument of
Yes.
whether okay, and I'm not, I'm not suggesting any disagreement. I recommended the book, and I think people, but I'm trying to now engage
Good.
this argument, which is after
Please. Please. Yes.
having this kind of a conversation. And it's, by the way, I don't claim I have great expertise of what's happening, because I'm telling you I'm really quite shocked about a lot of that's happening, and I didn't predict it quite this way. I frankly thought that there was a ruling structure in America, and going back to C. Wright Mills, that would have a longer run view, that wouldn't want to burn down the house for greed, that would care more about this alienation that's occurring and try to deal with it, co opt it, or so forth. What we have now is madness, anarchy in the form of Donald Trump and the people supporting him. Now, I just want to examine that a little bit, because we can't just dismiss the fact that America is at this moment very prosperous, more prosperous probably any society in human history has ever been. It has the means to solve its income inequalities, its homelessness. It has ample. It has a favored nation trading position. It gets deals all over the world with or without Trump, and including the control of the dollar. So, one thing I would like to explore is, why are we coming apart and doing something that an old I happen to have interviewed Nelson and David Rockefeller. To me, Nelson at some length. I care
Right.
these issues at one point in my life of what was then the ruling circles. And
Right.
they, in their commission on critical choices and the trilateral commission and so forth, they devoted a lot of time to how do you sustain it? How do you deal with the Tocqueville challenge of having an ever expanding middle class so people would be stakeholders and so forth? All of that has been abandoned. And what happened starting with Bill Clinton, if we want to take it away from Trump, is the fascination with the internet and the new technology, which you discuss very powerfully in your book. Uh, they bought the argument of the lobbyists and the financial community that we needed to destroy the New Deal restraints and regulation. We had to unleash both Wall Street to be able to be internationally effective and to back the new technology. And we had to back the new technocrats that were coming in. So you could have a Google or an Apple effectively have a monopoly that would have been in violation of any antitrust. Buy up any competitors, get rid of them, control the market. And they were very open about it, and it was supported. There were a few critics at the time, both the rise of the financial community, which you do discuss in your book, and these super wealthy corporations that are totally unaccountable, including being able to destroy jobs or rig trade and so forth. So it seems to me, and yes, the technology you can blame for alienation, but that's also by design. After all, the whole
Absolutely.
marketing mechanism of the internet is to exploit your privacy, your private information, so we can more effectively manipulate you to buy things you can't afford,
Right.
don't
Right.
need. Right. So we actually, the alienation was by design. And if you're not, have a moment of fame, and if you don't buy this product, you don't do that, then you should be depressed. And because they know so much about what you're thinking, my last book was
Right.
called They
Right.
Know Everything About You,
Right.
they can make you depressed. And if you don't perform in certain ways and buy this gadget and do this thing. So what I think is we're reaping what they have sowed, or they are. They were very conscious of building alienation into the American experience and destroying the apparent and obvious value of trade unions, of social organizations, of a moderate church, Christian church, and others that cared about the whole community. And okay, and instead, their religious experience now is actually goes along with creating chaos because, after all, if it's terrible, then it will become the second coming, and it'll be a great moment. And we really don't care about the secular life that's coming. We actually have the vice president believe something. Some of
Right.
our Supreme
Right.
Court
Right.
justices believe something of that. So disaster is actually to be welcomed. And so I'm just trying to stretch the points you were making earlier. I'm not contradicting anything
No,
here.
I see a lot of convergence, Robert, and much of the book is about the we mentioned Clinton, the abandonment of the New Deal. Much of my, not just here in this book, but is about the role of the Democratic Party in. So I mean, when the New Deal emerged, the Democratic Party was able to bring in large percentages of the American working class, and during what I wrote a book called Regime Change Begins at Home. I argued that between 1932 and 1980, basically workers were largely embedded they had a party to go to who had at least a kind of incipient social democratic agenda with labor and with social programs and so forth. Clinton was the beginning of, neoliberal capitalism, the kind of, very violent, destructive capitalism, which developed in the Reagan years and is at the heart of this book as well. I argue that neoliberalism is the heart of this turn from traditional capitalism toward, the sociopathic capitalism to the more extreme form. And the Democrats it's obvious what the Reagan Republican role of this was in building up the deregulation and the globalization that happened in the post 70s period. But the Democrats played an incredibly important role because they abandoned the New Deal. And abandoning the New Deal and embracing a kind of siloed identity politics, which basically essentially moved American political consciousness away from the economy and from class issues to really important cultural issues, but ones where race and gender were being separated out and turning people against each other on the basis it laid the foundation for the culture wars that have emerged since then. And the Democrats hold a very amount of, you know, toxic complicity in this. And you know, Kamala Harris's loss, which I analyze in some detail, is a apotheosis of this kind of and you know that what this has been part of is, I think the most important political thing that's happened in the last 30 or 40 years is the constant migration of the working class, which was always during the New Deal tied to, or at least a relatively reformist agenda, progressive agenda, to the kind of now the working class, the white working class, but even many young blacks and Latinos are moving into the Republican Party. And the Democrats own this. And, you know, I think that the turn, you know, that you describe, which is a big focus of my book, is a reflection of that. This new authoritarian, it is new. I agree with you that the society has taken a turn. I link it both to the rise of neoliberalism and the rise of the Democratic Party as an agent of this neoliberalism. And I mean, the Democratic Party has always been a corporate party, but the New Deal did provide forms of anti-sociocidal politics, which built up connections, social programs, a sense of collective identity, a sense of, you know, solidarity that could be possible in the workplace and in the broader society that might make a difference. That's gone. That, you know, and the workers have kept migrating. This, I think, is the biggest revolution in American politics: the migration of workers into the Republican Party and now into Trumpism. And I think there are all kinds of reasons, which I try to analyze in the book, as to why that's happening. But I think the Democrats play a hugely important role in this. Both their militarism, which is unrelenting and which is pouring, you know, and Trump, of course, is apotheosis of that. Trump is pouring over $1 trillion into the military and building up the Gaza catastrophe, and probably leading toward more and more money going into U.S. military, despite all of his claims to be anti-military. And he's basically taking neoliberalism toward the extreme degree. He's, you know, the big, beautiful bill has transferred more wealth upward to his 800 billionaires. As you said, 3 billionaires have close to half the wealth of the American population of 350 million people. I do want to differ with you just slightly on this idea that we are a very prosperous society today. If you look at the condition of ordinary workers in America, you know, one of the things I analyze in the book is the change in the legal wiring of employment. You know, most workers are not under traditional protections of the legal employment relationship, subject to the Fair Labor Standard Act and the, you know, the Wagner Act and so forth, because they're hired as contractors or gig workers or temps or other independent contractors who are not protected by any of the legal protections that the New Deal offered. So even if the New Deal had survived, these people would be subject. We have now six. You say that we're not as in bad shape. I agree with you. We're not nearly in the condition that, say, German workers were in the 30s. I agree with that. But on the other hand, we're not in this happy land for American workers. 61% repeatedly say in polls they are living paycheck to paycheck. One job loss, one illness, they think could spin them into oblivion.
Okay, so if I could just jump in here,
Sure.
I think you've put that very effectively. And I want to repeat, I'm not taking an issue with the book. I'm taking an issue only with, you know, I'm not even taking an issue. I'm trying to stretch the argument. So
Right.
let me, in the
And I
time that,
wanted to affirm what you said. I think everything you said was on the mark. I agree with you, Robert.
okay. So and if I was going to do this for 30 minutes, but if you have the time, let's go a little longer.
Sure. Yeah,
Because
yeah.
there's one, I want to address a huge question here about are we approaching fascism? And you mentioned Hannah Arendt, and you know, who's actually one of our great teachers about all this. And it seems to me two things that happened in relation to Germany that are worth considering, because as I tell my own students, we have to study Germany because they were the most like us.
Right.
Okay, they really were, and I happen to know because my father left Germany after World War I, and a lot of
Right.
my non-Jewish German relatives kept coming and still do. I've been to my father's hometown many times and all that sort of thing. And my mother was Jewish and from Lithuania, and all of my relatives there were killed. And then the question I've always asked in my life: how could my father's relatives kill my mother's relatives? Is very real.
Yes.
Well, the answer when I went back to Germany all these times and talked to my uncle, who I liked very much, who was in the fought at Stalingrad and was wounded, and wasn't a card-carrying Nazi or anything, farmer. But talk about it, and they kept talking about what had happened to the mark and what had happened. You could grow things, but you couldn't sell them, and you couldn't eat, you couldn't get a bottle of milk, and so forth. And so I don't want to lose that economic argument. There was, as we know, the collapse of the Weimar Republic, absolute disarray in a society that has stressed order, law, and so forth. And there
Well,
actually,
yeah.
and I don't think people were lying to me because I spent a lot of time on this. Uh, Anti-Semitism, at least in that part of Southwest Germany, was not an issue, or
Mm,
not a big issue. It was
mm,
scapegoat, yes, Wall
mm,
Street and this, yes, there was scapegoat, but it all had to do with they're getting this terrible deal. All I'm saying right now is they try this with China a little bit, but it's absurd to suggest that somehow China has taken the good jobs or Japan
right,
before that or so forth.
right,
All I mean is that, and let me swing in a little bit to Marxism here. In the traditional model, the ruling class in America, the smart people, you know, this was not true even, unfortunately, of Henry Ford back then, but still, they should be on the side of true globalization and trade and not having to interfere in everybody's life because it's actually still working very well. Okay, let me just stipulate that. That's what I
mhm,
mean. That we, and now what we're doing actually with these policies of high tariffs and demonizing the others, we're compelling China to make better chips than us and better cars and so forth. There's an irony. So then I think, and I thought a lot about this in relation to Germany, where was that responsible capitalist class that knew how to great manufacturing, great engineering skills, and so forth? And we know they made Hitler possible by giving up the fight against him, even though it would make a shambles of any classical economic theory. This crazy person, he didn't even look crazy, coming in and he's going to now give everybody a Volkswagen and he's going to do this and he's going to do that. But Mercedes and BMW, they all went along. They went along. What scares me in this moment is we're not getting any resistance from what one thought was an enlightened capitalist class that certainly talked a good game. And you have even the leaders of Apple and Google and so forth. First of all, some of them, yes, they have military contracts, but the fact of the matter is, they do very well in globalization. They're now betraying globalization. They're betraying has really worked for them. And they're betraying it in part out of greed. Yes, some of them are very greedy and want all the tax breaks and everything. Others are doing it out of fear, which also happened in Germany, right?
right.
They're afraid of Trump. They're afraid of being punished. Okay.
Correct.
And I
Yeah.
want to connect it a little bit because you're up there in Boston or you have been. And I want to connect a little bit about elite education in America because you have a place like Columbia and now Harvard and UCLA got punished so badly that in fact this what people like myself who were quite critical of some of the elite institutions, my old City College of New York education, but now I look what happened to this ruling class education. What happened to the elite universities that they're caving? They're just saying, yes, yes, master. What else do you want? Yes, we'll fire anybody. And I want to circle back, just since you brought up Hannah Arendt. My only personal contact with Hannah Arendt, uh, I was one of the editors of Ramparts at that time. I'd been to Israel at the time of the 60 War at the end, and I was in a panel at the uh, Young Men's Hebrew Association in, I think, 93rd Street or something in New York. And I didn't know she was in the audience.
Mm,
And uh, and I was talking about having been in Egypt and Israel at that time, and I thought, and this gets to the nationalist issue and the tribal issues, if
mm,
you like, that always get into these things, which certainly happened in Germany, right?
mhm,
Right?
mhm.
And I felt very isolated there. I was being attacked all over the place, because I thought it'd be a real disaster. Israel, I thought it was an unprovoked war, a war of choice. It's a 6 day war. I thought if they now control, now that they control the West Bank and Gaza, and that this will doom Israel a certain way. I think she was about the only person in that audience, and I was being harangued. I mean, attacked. And she came up to me. I didn't even recognize her or no, never met her. And she said, I just want to tell you, you're absolutely right. Don't let them get to you. They're missing the whole point
Mm.
because it's a mixture, she said. It's you find a tribal, as with the Germans, against the others, against the Slavs and so forth. You find a scapegoat, you find an enemy. So we're seeing a mixture of that now, right? Because ironically, on the campuses and everything, we're told you can't talk about this, you'll be fired if you do this. And it's all in the name of what? Protecting one group.
Oh, it's so ironic. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And
Yeah.
I'd like to talk about it a little bit because I never thought in my life, I'm a pretty old guy now. Uh, I never thought, growing up there in the Bronx and everything in a basically Jewish neighborhood, that fascism would come to America in the name of defending Jews.
Yeah.
I just really, it's just
Yeah.
absolutely mind boggling. And yet that's being used probably most effectively to justify the crackdown and
Right.
prevent people from speaking up about any of this stuff.
Yeah. Well, it is very ironic and tragic, and it's great. It's a reflection of divisions emerging in the Jewish community and in relation to what's happening in Israel. I mean, in Israel, there's huge conflict about Netanyahu's role, and the whole identity, what Jewish identity means, is under, deep. You can drive in north of Harvard Square in Cambridge, and you come to a big sign in Porter Square, which is about a mile north of Harvard Square, and you see a big sign which say radicals are destroying America, with huge letters saying signed by the American Jewish Committee. So you're seeing, Jewish elites of a certain stripe, totally embracing a kind of neo-fascist kind of politics that is embodied in much of what Netanyahu, and of course many people in Israel today, many ordinary Jews, are horrified about Netanyahu and want to see him gone. But if I can come back for a minute, I love the fact that you're trying to connect this to Germany and to the role of the elites in the United States. So my view is that there's, let's keep in mind that Trump, as you pointed out, while he's intimidating what you're calling the responsible capitalist class, I want to come back to that phrase of the responsible capitalist class. Um, he's offering that class a lot, right? His budget is the biggest redistribution of wealth in American history. He's moving money at an unprecedented level where it's already concentrated at unprecedented levels of inequality, even higher. And he's moving, of course, the tariffs are really an effort to eliminate. He wants to go back to the pre 1913 America where rich people didn't pay any taxes at all. They're pretty good at evading taxes now, but he's moving toward a McKinley style, you know, Andrew Jackson America, in which America can strike out to get the resources it needs globally. It doesn't need any kind of global rules at all. It doesn't even need the IMF, and it doesn't need taxes, and it particularly doesn't need taxes for wealthy people. So let's keep in mind that the cowardice of the quote capitalist elite is so intertwined with the greed of that elite and the fact that they think that they are getting, they're scared. I agree. They're not totally happy with what Trump is doing with trade and global issues, but they're getting a lot back. They're getting no taxes. They're getting an incredible reduction in regulation, a huge reduction of the destruction, total destruction of the welfare state, which Trump calls the deep state, of the American government, and in turn the movement toward the real welfare system of America, which is the corporate welfare system, and the building up. I mean, these people you mentioned in Silicon Valley are the recipients of the biggest amount of corporate welfare in history. These people are getting billions and billions of dollars of government contracts. I mean, the intersection between Silicon Valley and the national security state is unprecedented. The amount of money that's flowing into, you know, whether it's Meta or Alphabet or any of these, Palantir. This is becoming the information infrastructure of fascism, and it's hard to disentangle the finances of Silicon Valley from the finances of the national security state, the military-industrial complex, and America. The post 9/11 imperial presidency, which kind of morphed into, you got the Patriot Act, which was really an early, you had the rise of the imperial presidency, and then you had the rise of 9/11, and a series of Bush style wars and authoritarian acts like the Patriot Act, which were basically building the infrastructure of what Trump is now openly creating in his more open police stating and policing of federal police. That all goes back to the idea that the presidency, and this is built, by the way, into the Constitution. I'm doing a new book called Wired for Authoritarianism, which looks at the legal and constitutional structure of fascism in America. And the Constitution made it very easy for presidents to declare emergencies, whether they were economic or international. There's enough discretion in the role of the presidency, the way it's outlined in the Constitution and in law, for presidents to declare emergencies prolifically, the way Trump has now. He's used about 12 made up emergencies, whether it's around domestic policing or immigration or economics and tariffs and so forth, and trade deficits, and to use those emergencies as a way of shutting down basic due process rights, you know, um, basic restraints on the use of the military to actually move toward a kind of full scale American form of fascism. So I see the elites as both capitulating and celebrating. It's contradictory, but do you remember when Trump came into power? The first photograph in his inauguration was of 7 people standing with him, and they were the seven magnificent seven, leaders of these. They were the Peter Thiels of your great state, who are these religiously oriented far right kind of fascist capitalism. And by the way, fascist, I mean, there'd be a whole nother conversation about what is a responsible capitalist elite. Henry Ford, the DuPonts. There were a range of people in the 30s that I know you know about, but maybe some of our listeners don't. With the America First movement, which developed in the 30s in the United States, was full of responsible capitalists like Henry Ford and the DuPonts and others who were America never really wanted. We went into World War One, and I write about this history because the Morgans loaned so much money to England that they didn't want England. If England were to fall in World War One, they would have lost their shirt. So they wanted to make sure that England would prevail in World War One, and in by the time, and that led to some of the punitive, sanctions on Germany after World War One that Keynes, predicted correctly would lead to disaster in Germany and the kind of economic mayhem that you described so well when you were talking about Germany in the 30s. Um, but I think the elites in America have always been profoundly authoritarian. I'm a little bit, this is a longer conversation, but to talk about the responsible capitalist elites, those people were always, and the kind of global order that would somehow contribute to, well-being of America more generally. I understand sort of what you're talking about, but let's keep in mind that that global order was always part of a kind of hegemonic. It was kind of an American empire that emerged after World War II, as the European empires that had run the world for 500 years had pretty much destroyed each other in 2 world wars. And you got, starting with, the Truman and the Security Act. Wouldn't it have been wonderful if Henry Wallace had been able to survive as vice president and become president after everybody knew Roosevelt was going to die? If instead of Truman, who really founded the national security state with a series of national emergency declarations about the Cold War, and that triggered a kind of militarized globalization that became they sort of went to the heart of these sort of quote responsible capitalist elites. I don't see any way of easily disentangling the American global elite that emerged, in the American Empire era, hegemony, the flower, what Henry Lucy would call the Great American Century. This shift over toward, I mean, it's not a hard um, sort of intellectual act to imagine how this would emerge through the 9/11 experience and the kind of concentration of power in the presidency, which always had its roots in the Constitution. Despite, I'm writing a lot about the Magna Carta and its role in the framing of the Constitution. And while, the barons, the Magna Carta was called the Article of the Barons, it was never to protect democracy. And the Constitution was written in the name of the American Magna Carta. But that Magna Carta was always to produce an aristocracy. The idea of the serfs in 1215, when the Magna Carta, the sort of predecessor of the Constitution, was written, was absurd. They wanted to basically preserve the power of the nobility, the barons. And America had its own aristocracy with people like Jefferson and George Washington was the largest slaveholder in America. I mean, if you look at the foundation of America, it grew out of this aristocracy, which was running much of America before the Revolution, and it ran the same people with the same names were running America after the Revolution, and they were basically enshrining a kind of constitutional and legal and economic order that was creating this elite that, true, observed over time after the Civil War certain kinds of civic order. I call it a democratic veneer, but it's meaningful because it had civil liberties, it had certain kinds of voting rights, it had certain real protections that were important. But intertwined in that whole system of, quote, responsible capitalism, built before the New Deal and even during the New Deal, were a series of, extremely predatory, what I call wiring. I've just done a new book, Robert, called The Wired for Authoritarianism, which looks at constitutionalism, legalism, and the American corporate system you know, from a constitutional and legal as well as economic point of view. And this responsible capitalist class that you're talking about was observing the etiquette of civility and democracy at a time that it was implementing all over the world dictatorships and regimes of power that were reflecting ideals of many of these people who are part of this, quote, responsible capitalist elite. So much of the work that I've been doing and in Bonfire, this book on American Sociocide, is a reflection of the contradictory tendencies in this capitalist class. I'm not sure we're very far apart on this because I understand what you
No, we're
mean.
not. Look, we're going to wrap this up, but we're not at all apart on this.
Yeah,
Look, first of all, even Nelson Rockefeller and David Rockefeller, in certain ways, more enlightened. They certainly were ruthless, and both politically and economically, and the irrationality of a Henry Ford in
right.
flirting with Hitler was appalling to them. But still, he could make an argument. I want to close this. Now we've gone way beyond, but it's worth listening to. I think. I hope. But all I'm saying is one could make a claim for capitalism, classical capitalism, as a sane response to organizing markets. If in fact you have Adam Smith's invisible hand, if in fact you do separate the private sector from the government sector, if in fact you are driven by market realities of what sells and what buys, and that includes the right of workers to organize. They did it in the guilds to redress their grievances and try to get more pay. So and Peter Thiel is supposed to be a libertarian originally. You could make this argument that there was a value to it. What I'm saying is, despite believing in this, they only seem to like capitalism that has political power, that has government behind them. Um,
Absolutely. I mean, that's
yeah,
the history of capitalism, Robert. It's state capitalism.
yeah.
This is one of the great mythologies of capitalism, the
Right.
idea that the
So,
state.
on
Yeah,
an odd note, China, if we take these two major powers in the world now, one and two, U.S. and China, China has actually gotten this communism to harness, most
right,
recently, get the government to hold back worker demands, get the government to be nicer to private enterprises, particularly foreign ones, and
right.
so forth. And the irony of all this is the U.S. used to be able to get a lot of traffic, a lot of influence by claiming to be for individual freedom, claiming to be for some democracy, civil liberty. That has been thrown out without anybody even noticing it. I don't
Right.
know how anyone in a straight face could go give lectures to any of these other governments at a time when you're just rounding people up and
Right.
sending them to, Uganda or sending. I mean,
Right. Right.
it's making what the Chinese did during the pandemic seem mild,
Yeah.
and yet this is why I got back to that original point. They are throwing away a very powerful weapon that American capitalism had, which was its democratic front appearance,
Right.
sense of
And both
justice.
for global and at home. That front is extremely important. I call it a veneer, but it's really important. And you're right that, I mean, in this the work I've been doing, I've been talking about the rewiring of American power from what I call covert authoritarianism and rule, which has this very strong civilizing democratic veneer, which had some meaning to it, as you're pointing out, toward what I'm calling overt wiring, which is wiring of power in which power is more nakedly concentrated and displayed in the form that Trump is doing right now. And in this book, Bonfire, and in the new book, Wired for Authoritarianism, that I'm doing, it analyzes this evolution of the wiring of power from the more covert form, which had this strong thing that you've been describing here, which is this very strong sort of visible appearance of rules and order and some real benefits going toward both democratic participation and toward people in every rank of society. That's being stripped away. The veneer is being stripped away. But if you looked at what was under that veneer historically, it was always a very contradictory system, because it had this veneer of democracy and market prosperity and all that, but it always was highly authoritarian in the actual concentration of power and money. And I've been tracing this. I mean, as I told you right at the beginning of our conversation, I think contradiction is the central idea that Marx brought into social analysis. And there's this contradictory set of forces that I think our conversation has been playing back and forth with about the contradictions between the quote free market, non-statist kind of American capitalism that seem to be playing by certain kinds of rules for the worker and for the rule, and the kind of overt extreme form uh, of kind of power that we're seeing emerge now, but which I argue in the book has a long history that is just under the surface of the veneer, which is both legal, constitutional, and economic that I'm describing. So it's an interesting. I'm sorry we don't have more time to talk
But
about.
well, we have time for me to now put a constructive spin on this, which is also in your book, because your book at the end holds out a hope for defeating these forces. It's not all a downer, holds
Right,
out a hope for that these contradictions will produce resistance. And
correct.
I would like to do justice to your book by stressing that a little bit. I mean, because otherwise, who's going to even want to think about it? They want to
Right.
go get drunk or
Well,
something.
thank you for taking note of that.
Yeah. So let me stress the positive of the contradictions, or what Leonard Cohen, I don't think he was a Marxist, a songwriter and singer, said there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets through. Well, the light is coming through now,
Right.
and it's coming through for the whole world. So you have this odd phenomena of India being brought in with China together right this week or so forth. You have Saudi Arabia allied with Russia to jointly take advantage of the market so they're not ripped off by the U.S. You have Brazil now sending most of its soybeans to China, undermining American farmers because Brazil has been given this fierce tariff, just as India was by Trump. So the U.S. no longer has the power. They have the military power to destroy anybody on short notice, other than the nuclear issue, which keeps them in some check. But they don't have the power to control the market. Even the dollar seems to will be sacrificed to some degree.
Yes, I think so.
So
Yes.
I'm going to turn it over to you for. We might as well make this a solid hour. I think it's an interesting discussion. We got 5 minutes and almost six. Why don't you talk about that? Because I think if people don't want to lose too much sleep at night, that these contradictions should be thought about, and you're seeing them in the polls. we're seeing them in some real backbone
Mm,
coming to the
right.
Democratic Party. I mean, at first the Democrats were just going to be more jingoistic than Trump, and they were going to attack him for being a Russian agent and a pacifist or something. They can't do that now because he's obviously of a different mold, and the whole thing was kind of a phony. It was a phony, but now you see this statements coming out of Democrats, not so much that they could support a true progressive for mayor of New York, but nonetheless, the Cuomo line is no
Right.
longer.
Right.
So, and then one thought I bring up all the time when I remember when Hillary Clinton was running against Trump, Trump said, she said, he says he's going to make America great. And Hillary Clinton said, America's always been great. And your book and your idea on how it was wired in is a denial of that. This was propaganda. It
Hmm.
wasn't great. That's why we had slavery. That's why we broke trade unions. That's why we conquered other countries and made all these wars. So I'll give you the last now almost 5 minutes to wrap it all up. But talk about that part of your book, which we
Okay. Well,
haven't.
thank you, Robert. Because, the contradiction, I guess, in my own thinking is that one, I have a grim analysis because I try to be as truthful as I can about American history and American politics and power, the structure of power. But I've never felt that this long historical oligarchical kind of power that's wired into American history um, has been, and we also see, and I've written extensively, as you probably know, about American labor, racial, feminist, other kinds of struggles, which are now beginning to emerge and coalesce in this really remarkable resistance. There's a Erica Chenoweth, one of the social movement scholars, has the so-called 3.5% rule. We're at that 3.5%. Her rule is if you have more than 35.5% of people in any country mobilizing against an autocratic regime go out on the streets and protest, you have a pretty good chance of seeing success. And we've already crossed that threshold. We've already had more than 12 million people out on the streets in America, and there's going to be big labor demonstrations and big resistance against the rounding up of the policing of Chicago and New York coming up. So these demonstrations are simply going to grow bigger. So I believe the most profound contradiction is the grimness of the repressive apparatus that Trump is mobilizing is also mobilizing things I did not expect. I did not expect large numbers of people out in Wyoming and Texas and so forth to come out saying you can't take the woman who works in the diner that I go to every day for coffee and deport her to El Salvador or to Uganda or someplace like that. Americans are coming out in very large numbers, and you said some other important things, Robert, which is that we're seeing in the polls incredible numbers. About greater than 50% say they're sick of capitalism. The close between 40 and 50%, depending on the poll, say they are sort of interested in democratic socialism. They are against they're moving against war. They're saying war is simply a shift of money for workers to the American corporation. They're outraged at the big beautiful bill, which has put so many billions of dollars, taken it from ordinary workers and put them in the hands of very, very, very never in history have we seen such rich people. We've never in history seen this level of inequality, and people are seeing it and they're responding. And the polling and the resistance people out on the street are showing that people are not. Everybody is afraid. There's a lot of silence on the university. There's a lot of fear. I know it personally. Most people I know who are teaching or my students, they are afraid. There is very widespread fear. So again, we're dealing with a contradictory situation where people are very afraid, but they're also finding connections out on the streets, in their classrooms, in their religious congregations, to find places to connect. Even this contradiction of online, reality, which is so. My students are telling me on. We started with this that the sociocide they're experiencing, the breakdown of any kind of sense of being with anybody, that is being and exacerbated by social media. It's also a foundation for connection, and where you can connect with, resistors in Hungary or Poland, where people are facing some of the same struggles, or France or Italy, or if you're in California, in New York, or whatever. So the book is very truthful in my view about the grimness of the diagnosis, both historically and today. You can't be more grim than an analysis of sociocide as the reality of American life. At the same time, based on my own story, sort of study of American history, and there's always been profound social movements in the United States. Whether we're talking about the populists in the first Gilded Age, who people should read the Kansas Agenda, the effort to want to put Wall Street under some sort of public control, because credit was like now, they just couldn't afford to live if you were a farmer in the 1890s. There's been, the anti-war movement that's not well known in the beginning of First World War that led to the Sedition Act in 1918, the Anti-Immigration Act, which was very similar. The liberal Woodrow Wilson was one of the most fascist presidents in American history. We had the America First movement, the Birchers. I have a whole history in a forthcoming of the far right populism, which is extremely neo-fascist and authoritarian. So there's a long buildup, but at the same time, there's a history of left, what I call positive populism, which is the subject of my next book coming out, which I talk about in this book some, which is people, progressive people, ordinary people coming together and saying, this is crazy what we're dealing with in America. A kind of we have a prosperous country where the wealth is being concentrated and the power is being concentrated in a tiny elite of people. And people are waking up to this. Trump is waking people up to this. Trump numbers, polling wise again, are in the trash can. He's down at 25 to 30% on almost all of his major initiatives around the economy, around immigration. And again, immigration, I'm so heartened by the fact that middle America seems to be, even though immigration was border security was a very big issue. I mean, I come from a family like you do of German, Russian Jews. And I know when I talk about immigrants and deportation and concentration camps, that has meaning in my own family experience. And so I didn't realize that I would see this level of response among ordinary people, to try to protect immigrants and to reject this kind of police state that's really clearly emerging and is going to grow, as you pointed out, very rapidly in coming months. But this book has a very positive sense of possibility. I really believe that this kind of repression, which is overt, rips away the veneer of all the wise capitalist leadership and shows what's also right at the underbelly of American system, is wakening people up, and people are going out. I love watching this. Every day I watch Rachel Maddow will show the posters of resistors, the creative signs out in Wyoming and Nebraska and so forth, where ordinary people are drawing these signs about oligarchy and democracy and peace and no kings. And I just see a level of vibrancy and emergence that I just returned from the Chicago, and I was amazed at the vibrancy of the street. There's a kind of multiracial. Chicago has a lot of problems, but there's a kind of urban life that I didn't expect to see there, because I'm not seeing it quite so much in Boston, where the elite universities are being intimidated, as you said, and being cowed.
Yeah.
But I see in the larger society an honest sense of awakening. I don't feel confident that this will succeed, but I feel there's a real shot we have at
Well,
a new
one,
development taking place. So
yeah,
I'm
one
hopeful.
sign that that may be happening is I just was reading a story how they're building this huge potential concentration camp in Texas
Correct.
with
Yeah,
much greater capacity, but on the other hand, they're being forced, at least temporarily, to put down their alligator concentration camp
that's
in
right.
Florida. I'm going to end this arbitrarily because we've gone over the witching hour, and I want to thank you, Charles Derber. I'm going to blow the title, so I'll just say bonfire, and you can look it up. It's worth reading, and not worth reading. It's essential reading. And I want to thank the people for putting the show on. Joshua Shear, our producer, who kept bugging me to do it, and I'm happy he did. Diego Ramos, our managing editor of SharePost, who sometimes writes the introduction. Max Jones, who puts it up on YouTube and edits the video. The JKW Foundation, in memory of Gene Stein, a terrifically independent and insightful journalist. It gives us some funding, as does Integrity Media. Len Goodman, a very important socially conscious attorney in Chicago, and the group that he's involved with, for giving us additional funding. See you next week, or the next time I find someone interesting to talk to. I don't have to be hooked any longer to the weekly schedule of public radio. I can actually do a couple or three or four of these a week. So see you again with the next one. Thank you. Bye.